Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. We are reading A Wrinkle in Time, and we are starting in chapter 6. It's called The Happy Medium. Let's get started. Again, they focused their eyes on the crystal ball. The earth, with its fearful covering of dark shadows, swam out of view, and they moved rapidly through the Milky Way. And there was the thing again. Watch, the medium told them. The darkness seemed to seethe and writhe. Was this meant to comfort them? Suddenly there was a great burst of light through the darkness. The light spread out, and where it touched the darkness disappeared. The light spread until a patch of the dark thing had vanished, and there was only a gentle shining, and through the shining came the stars, pure, clear and pure. Then slowly the shining dwindled until it too was gone, and there was nothing but stars and starlight. No shadow, no fear, only the stars and the clear darkness of space, quite different from the fearful darkness of the thing. You see, the medium cried, smiling happily, it can be overcome. It is it is being overcome all the time. Mrs. Whatsit sighed, a sigh so sad that Meg wanted to put her arms around her and comfort her. Tell us exactly what happened then, please, Charles Wallace said in a small voice. It was a star, Mrs. Whatsit said sadly. A star giving up its life in battle with the thing. It won. Oh, yes, my children, it won. But it lost its life in the winning. Mrs. Witch spoke again. Her voice sounded tired, and they knew that speaking was a tremendous effort for her. It was not so long ago for you, was it? She asked gently. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head. Charles Wallace went up to Mrs. Whatsit. I see. Now I understand. You were a star once, weren't you? Mrs. Whatsit covered her face with her hands and as though she was embarrassed, and nodded. And you did what that star just did. With her face still covered, Mrs. Whatsit nodded again. Charles Wallace looked at her very solemnly. I should like to kiss you. Mrs. Whatsit took her hand down from her face and pulled Charles Wallace to her in a quick embrace. He put his arms around her neck and pressed his cheek against hers, and then kissed her. Meg felt that she would have liked to have kissed Mrs. Whatsit too, but after Charles Wallace, anything that she or Calvin did or said would be an anticlimax. She contented herself with looking at Mrs. Whatsit. Even though she was used to Mrs. Whatsit's odd get-up, the very oddness of it was what made her seem so comforting, and realized with a fresh shock that it was not Mrs. Whatsit herself that she was seeing at all. The true Mrs. Whatsit, Meg realized, was beyond human understanding. And what she saw was only the game Mrs. Whatsit was playing. It was an amusing and charming game, a game full of both laughter and comfort, but it was only the tiniest facet of all the things Mrs. Whatsit could be. I didn't mean to tell you, Mrs. Whatsit faltered. I didn't mean ever to let you know. But oh, my dears, I did so love being a star. You were still very young, Mrs. Witch said, her voice fainting, chiding. The medium sat looking happily at the star-filled sky in her ball, smiling and nodding and chuckling gently. But Meg noticed that her eyes were drooping, and suddenly her face fell forward when she gave a faint snore. Poor thing, Mrs. Whatsit said. We've worn her out. It's very hard work for her. Please, Mrs. Whatsit, Meg asked, what happens now? Why are we here? What do we do next? Where is Father? When are we going to get him? She clasped her hands pleadingly. One thing at a time, love. Mrs. Whatsit said. Mrs. Who cut in. She's speaking in Portuguese now. That's Portuguese for walls have ears. Yes, let's go inside, Mrs. Whatsit said. Come, we'll let her sleep. But as they turned to go, the medium jerked her head up and smiled at them radiantly. You weren't going to go without saying goodbye to me, were you? We thought we'd let you sleep, dear. Mrs. Whatsit patted the medium's shoulder. We worked you terribly hard, and we know you must be very tired. But I was going to give you some ambrosia, or nectar, or at least some tea. At this, Meg realized that she was hungry. How much time had passed since they had had their bowl of stew, she wondered. Mrs. Whatsit said, "Oh, thank you, dear, but I think we'd better get going." "They don't need to eat, you know," Charles Wallace whispered to Meg. "At least not food, the way we do. Eating's just a game with them. As soon as we get organized again, I'll remind them that they'll have to feed us sooner or later." The medium smiled and nodded. "It does seem as though I would be able to do something nice for you, after having had to show those poor children such horrid things. Would they like to see their mother before they go?" "Could we see father?" Meg asked eagerly. "No," Mrs. Witch said. "We are going to your father, Meg. Do not be impatient." "But she could see her mother, couldn't she?" the medium wheedled. "Oh, why not?" Mrs. Whatsit put it in. "It won't take long, and it can't do any harm." "And Calvin, too?" Meg asked. "Could he see his mother, too?" Calvin touched Meg in a quick gesture, and whether it was of thanks or apprehension, she wasn't sure. "I think it's a mistake," Mrs. Witch said disapprovingly. "But since you have mentioned it, I suppose you must go ahead." "I hate it when she gets cross," Mrs. Whatsit said, glancing over at Mrs. Witch. "And the trouble is, she always seems to be right. But I really don't see how it could hurt, and it might make you feel better. Go on, medium dear." The medium, smiling and humming softly, turned the crystal ball a little in her hand. Stars, comets, and planets flashed across the sky, and then the earth came into view again. The darkened earth closer and closer till it filled the globe, and they had gone through the darkness until the soft white clouds and the gentle outline of the continent shone clearly. "Calvin's mother first," Meg whispered to the medium. The globe became hazy and cloudy, then shadows began to solidify, to clarify, and they were looking into an untidy kitchen with a sink full of unwashed dishes. In the front of the sink stood an unkempt woman with gray hair stringing about her face. Her mouth was open, and Meg could see the toothless gums, and it seemed that she could almost hear her screaming at two small children who were standing by her. Then she grabbed a long wooden spoon from the sink and began whacking one of the children. "Oh dear," the medium murmured. The picture began to dissolve. "I didn't really." "That's all right," Calvin said in a low voice. "I think I'd rather you knew." Instead of reaching out to Calvin for safety, Meg took his hand in hers, not saying anything in words, but trying to tell him by the pressure of her fingers what she felt. If anyone had told her only the day before that she, Meg, a snaggle-toothed, myopic, clumsy, would be taking a boy's hand to offer him comfort and strength, particularly a popular and important boy like Calvin, the idea would have been beyond her comprehension. But now it seemed as natural to want to help and protect Calvin as it did Charles Wallace. The shadows were swirling in the crystal again, and they cleared. Meg began to recognize her mother's lab at home. Mrs. Murray was sitting perched on her high stool, writing away on a sheet of paper on a clipboard in her lap. She's writing father, Meg thought, the way she always does, every night. The tears that she could never learn to control swam in her eyes as she watched. Mrs. Murray looked up from her letter, almost as though she were looking towards the children, and then her head drooped. She put it down on the paper and sat there, huddled up, letting herself relax into unhappiness that she never allowed her children to see. And now the desire for tears left Meg. The hot protective anger she felt for Calvin when she looked into his home, she now felt towards her mother. "Let's go," she cried harshly. "Let's do something." "She's always so right," Mrs. Whatsit murmured, looking towards Mrs. Witch. "Sometimes I wish she'd just say, 'I told you so,' and have done with it." "I only meant to help," the medium wailed. "Oh, medium dear, don't feel badly," Mrs. Whatsit said swiftly. Excuse me. "Look at something cheerful, do. I can't bear to have you distressed." It's all right, Meg assured the medium earnestly. Truly it is, Mrs. Medium, and we thank you very much. Are you sure? The medium asked, brightening. Of course, it really helped me ever so much because it made me mad. And when I'm mad, I don't have room to be scared. Well, kiss me goodbye for good luck then, the medium said. Meg went over to her and gave her a quick kiss, and so did Charles Wallace. The medium looked smiling at Calvin and winked. I want the young man to kiss me, too. I always did love red hair, and it'll give you good luck, laddie me love. Calvin bent down blushing and awkwardly kissed her on the cheek. The medium tweaked his nose. You've got a lot to learn, my boy, she told him. Now, goodbye, medium dear, and many thanks, Mrs. Whatsit said. I dare say we'll see you in an eon or two. Where are you going, in case I want to tune in? The medium said. Kamazods, is what Mrs. Whatsit told her. Where and what was Kamazods? Meg did not like the sound of the word, or the way in which Mrs. Whatsit pronounced it.